Earlier this year, our Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, recommended Army leaders read the book, The Arms of the Future, Technology in Close Combat in the 21st Century by Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute in London, Dr. Jack Watling. We're so very fortunate to be able to arrange for Dr. Watling to join us this morning and share his thoughts that have closely aligned with the Chief's vision as we transition the Army to meet the current challenges. Again, please help me welcome Dr. Jack Watling to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Now, I professionally spend a lot of time talking to soldiers, and all soldiers sign up to contend with the enemy. But when you're standing in front of an audience that you know decided to take as a career option a continual fight with physics at the same time, you know you're in front of a fun crowd. So it's really good to be here. Now, to reflect on some of the comments that have already been made this morning, I was asked to speak about the future operating environment, challenges in that environment, and what that might mean for aviation. But I'm reflecting on the fact that I just got back from Ukraine. I came straight from there to here. And so last Thursday, I was sitting in a meeting room, and we were at the strategic echelon. So I was with ministerial level, and we were reviewing all of the returns from combat engagements over the previous month and comparing it to the month before. We were looking at the data for what we anticipated the enemy to be doing in the next 3 months, and on that basis, rewriting the high priority target list for down to company level across the theater. And in combination with that, that was directly integrated into the industrial backbone so that the decisions made there would rework the prioritization for warheads, for the designs and types of UAVs that were prioritized in the production line, those air-launched effects that were mentioned previously. And so while I was asked to talk about the future, I want to reinforce that point. The Army is focused on transformation and contact because a lot of these things are realities today. And these trends are going to come at us really fast. I want to begin by talking about some of the broader drivers of change in how we fight, and then going to narrow down on the utility of aviation, the enduring utility of aviation, and what those changes in technology and the way we fight mean for the aviation community. Really, I want to focus on 3 fundamental technological developments. The first is the proliferation of high-fidelity sensors connected with the ability to process the returns from those sensors and compare the returns in real time across a wide area. That gives commanders and operators at all echelons today on the battlefield an unprecedented level of fidelity, of understanding of what is in front of them. The ability to detect and strike, the ability to observe movement and to make decisions is something that can be distributed across the entire force. When you're in Ukraine and you're with a combat unit, there may be 50 friendly UAVs operating in your battle area. Most of them are not organic to your unit, but you can dial into those feeds. When you want to call for fire, you might give the coordinates to an artillery unit. That artillery unit will just dial in to the UAV overlooking the area that they are going to engage, and will work out their own fire solutions. They don't need a forward controller talking them onto the target or adjusting fire. They will adjust off the feed. And that is the level of integration that is being achieved through sensors on a battlefield against a peer or near-peer adversary with some of the highest grade electronic warfare capabilities in the world. Which brings me on to the second major driver of change, and that is the continually contested nature of the electromagnetic spectrum. We heard it from the Vice. The centrality of sensors and then networks determines the future of conflict. Sometimes we used to hear people talk about a denied EMS. We used to talk about fighting unplugged. How do we revert to dealing with the fact that we don't have access to our systems? To be honest, that isn't really what we observe on the battlefield. The EMS is almost never denied, but it is always contested. Where it is available is changing dynamically, and our ability to understand it, react, and fight through determines the efficiency of your force against the enemy. You cannot afford to abandon that fight. You can't just unplug. You will not be competitive. You may need to revert for a period of time, but that is only giving you a foundation from which you need to re-engage and recontest. That's what determines your efficiency. And the third thing is the proliferation at scale of precision and long-range fires. That is reshaping the battlefield. If you look at the fighting in Ukraine today, we can talk about force quality, we can talk about training, but there is a fundamental reality that units are being attrited from 30 kilometers out before they get to the front line, even at battalion level. And the result is that units really struggle, noting that that attrition in depth continues the whole way through that stretch of battlefield to reach the flot with enough combat power to break through and maintain momentum. The units at the flot in Ukraine are really, really dispersed and very small. And the reason that works is because even at the company level, they are reaching out 15 kilometers to attrit and degrade the enemy. And that imposes a whole series of frictions on tempo and how we fight that we need to think through. So what does that mean for aviation? Well, I'm going to speak very briefly about what I see as the enduring value of aviation to a combat commander. The first is flexibility. You know, I've never heard a combat commander in a war say that they have enough helicopters. Why? Because you can always find jobs for them. If it's battlefield circulation, if it's recce, if it's combat, supporting convoys, if it's deep strike, maneuvering your assets around, medevac, the list of missions that aviation supports is extremely diverse, and the platforms themselves can be flexibly moved between these missions. Now, I wouldn't normally suggest that the AH-64 is a great way of inserting infantry, but the British Army has done it, right? So these platforms are really flexible, and that is extremely valuable to the commander. The second thing is fusion. If you think about what a helicopter pilot and the team in that aircraft are doing, they are connected with the air picture, they are interacting with air assets, they are communicating with ground assets who they work with every day, they understand the battle, they are close to the operators in the tactical close fight. At the same time, they have sensors, comms capability, the training to be able to coordinate and direct fires. And so they are able to fuse a huge amount of information into one platform, which makes them really powerful. And that fusion function means that when we think about how you fight through a contested and layered enemy defense, that's extremely valuable. The third thing is reach and speed. We heard it from the vice chief, right? That ability to punch out, take the seam that the enemy doesn't expect and get your capabilities where they need to be, whether that is reacting to the enemy who's causing you a problem so that it's no longer a dilemma, or whether that is exploiting an opportunity, a gap that has opened up to punch somewhere that the enemy never wanted you to be. That is extremely valuable to the commander. The problem we have is that those points of utility for aviation are being contested by a range of threats driven by those changes in the operating environment that I articulated at the beginning. The first one is something that we're all pretty familiar with, which is layered air defense. But when we look at the level of integration and the complexity and sophistication of modern air defenses, it is becoming a pretty ugly picture. You know, it used to be the case, if we think about Army aviation going into Iraq and hitting the central node, having worked at very, very low altitude of the Iraqi integrated air defense system, thereby opening the gap for other assets to flow through. Today, these systems are self-healing and they are collaborating, right? The Russians don't switch their radar on very much, and there isn't a central node to hit. The result being that an asset that is stood in the deep can have several radar, it can be plugged into the enemy combat aviation patrols that are working, looking down, and therefore how you fight in becomes extremely difficult. We are also seeing, noting what I said about the munitions, a tendency towards active seekers, and the profile of attack from enemy air defense systems is increasingly a lofting attack. It is coming in from above. It is a ballistic trajectory. And so terrain masking doesn't really help if they have some indication of the basket that you are moving through and where they're going to drop that missile, right? We have seen Ukrainian aircraft being shot down at extremely low altitude, and that is a concern. The second thing is UAS and counter-UAS and the relationship between these two elements. The reality is, on the modern battlefield, you have 50 UAVs in the air at any given time across every 10 kilometers of FLOT in Ukraine. It would be a bit different in the Indo-Pacific, but when units get into contact, every platoon in Ukraine is generating 2 ISR UAVs, right? You can map out the number of UAVs expended per day, per battalion, and it looks pretty similar to what we would consider indirect fire munitions, right? So that means that you have an extremely cluttered and contested airspace that is not being controlled. No one is really clearing who's putting these things in the air, partly because of the contested EMS and the risk that that exposes the pilots if they start trying to synchronize this stuff. But the other challenge that you have is that there's loads of enemy UAVs, right? There's usually 5 at least on every G-lock behind the front line at the moment. The Russians are putting 1,500 orbits of medium altitude UAVs over Ukraine every day. And that's excluding all the tactical stuff. That's Orlans and things that are flying at 9,000, 13,000 feet. So the risk, of course, is that you crash into them. But the other aspect is that, and this is something where we haven't yet seen the implications fully roll out, so we need to anticipate it. The threat from all of those UAVs, all of that observation, all of that strike capability for ground forces is crippling, and therefore ground forces have to have organic counter-UAS capability at every echelon. And at lower echelons, it might be quite simple. It might just be situational awareness. But when that situational awareness starts being pushed back to assets that can do something about it, hard kill effectors, that becomes a big problem for aviation. In Ukraine at the moment, there is a very dense belt of passive acoustic sensors throughout the battle space, and that is being layered with passive radar. Now, those are good enough to track individual UAVs and classify them with almost no false positives across the battle space. I can guarantee you helicopter rotors are louder, and you can hear them from a lot further away. And so those passive sensor networks, which are becoming fundamental to ground force survivability, are also a problem for aviation. In particular, when we start seeing cheap interceptors being used that are pretty fast, they don't have huge range, but they are usually optical seekers, so they are image matching. And what the Ukrainians are doing, and the Russians are now adopting, is using that passive sensor laydown to cue launches of UAVs with an explosive to crash into enemy reconnaissance vehicles. Now, I guarantee that is a problem for helicopters when you try and cross the FLOT, because that is a very, very dense, very, very deadly belt of capability which is looking for you. And the third thing I want to highlight in terms of threat, I know this is a bit of a downer, but I think we have to acknowledge the problem set. The third problem is long-range precision fires. There have been a couple of instances in Ukraine where helicopters have been splashed at their forward arming and refueling points. They were on the ground for a little bit too long. Iskander was queued onto them. But actually, when you look at the range of these threat systems, it's a much bigger problem for maintenance and logistics. And again, I think this is completely consistent with what the Vice Chief said, that you need to be very, very lean in your maintenance, and you need to be able to redeploy those maintenance capabilities pretty rapidly, because once the enemy understands the pattern of life, they can reach out and they can affect you there. So that's a serious challenge. Does that mean that aviation is a waning capability? I would say no. No, because when we look at these problems in isolation, they appear unsurmountable. But when we look at the evolution of aviation as a contribution to the joint force, as a combined arms element, then actually those three aspects that I highlighted of fusion, flexibility, range, and speed still have a huge amount to offer. The question is, how do we employ it? So the first thing I want to highlight is that I can push uncrewed vehicles, air-launched effects, into the box. And I can put a lot of them into the enemy battle space. They will have a very, very low probability of kill. The Russians tripled the number of Shahed 136 loitering munitions that they were firing into Ukraine, or one-way attack munitions that they were firing into Ukraine between November and January of this year. That should have been a huge problem because the Ukrainians are pretty short on air defense. And it did not lead to an uptick in hits, in strikes. Because it turns out relatively slow flying, relatively cheap munitions that follow quite predictable behaviors are not that difficult to destroy. And it's not the case that if you fire more in, you get more out. There's a sweet spot. Generally speaking, the sweet spot is determined by how many exquisite munitions you can put in at the same time and the relationship between them, the complexity of the strike package. And so, why is that relevant for aviation? Because aviation has an extremely high probability of kill because it has that human there, it has the flexibility, it has the fusion, in order to be able to maximize damage when you get onto the objective. How do you get there? Well, exactly the same way that the Ukrainians or the Russians struggle to get cruise missiles onto target, but when they build it into a strike package with one-way effectors, with offensive counter-air, in our case, the Ukrainians can't quite do that, but the ability to push back those overwatching enemy caps, then all of a sudden you can concentrate firepower in a way that will completely unhinge an enemy force. That is a valuable capability. Deep strike is something that is probably not the primary mission at this point in the threat environment, but when the opportunity opens up, it is a punch that the enemy has to be very, very wary of. And therefore it has a permanent shaping effect and imposes inefficiency on the enemy, even if it is a very relatively rare mission, right? Now, just to put this in the context of US Army decision-making, if the ability to bring that lethality to bear is dependent upon integration with air-launched effects, with the Air Force, with other EMS capabilities, then you need to be really well networked in. And in that context, I think we can see the logic of centralizing on the Apache E model. The Apache is still a very, very capable system. The E model has the connectivity and has the ability to do the integration. And so that is still a viable option. The second one is range and reach. One of the functions or implications of pervasive deep fires is that it spreads out the force. It means that a lot of your support and enablement is pushed back. And so it introduces latency between a commander making a decision and being able to actually shape the outcome on the battlefield. Now, in Ukraine, that is imposed on us by fires, by enemy systems. If we think about it in the Indo-Pacific, it's just imposed by distance, right? And actually, that presents a huge opportunity because the fact that it is complicated to move between terrain features means that there are going to be a lot more seams. The density of sensing and the number of troops on the flot in the Indo-Pacific is actually going to be less by virtue of the fact that if I put people on an island, I now need to sustain them. Well, we've actually seen this play out in Ukraine, in Krynki, when the Ukrainians surged troops across the Dnipro River and really, really struggled to sustain it. The Ukrainian commander faced a choice. He could surge more troops across. He had set the conditions to do so. He decided not to, which was a sensible decision, because he calculated that if he sent those troops across and they expanded the bridgehead, they would take terrain, they would not take enough terrain to be decisive, and then he would not be able to assure their resupply. Now, if we bring that across to the Indo-Pacific, it suggests that we will have smaller force packages, therefore a less dense threat environment, but we will still have the tyranny of distance, firstly imposed by enemy fires, and secondly, imposed by the geography. The effect on our operations means that speed of maneuvering assets and equipment between those points becomes absolutely critical. And so within that context, it is completely understandable why the US Army has prioritized for modernization, speed and reach, right? And the third element is flexibility. And here I'm going to make a potentially controversial pitch, but essentially a pitch against our usual instincts. Because when I start laying out the layered threat and the problem sets that I've just talked about, people tend to go, okay, well, we're going to have pods and widgets, and we're going to add all of these effectors onto our platforms. Unfortunately, that's going to significantly increase the weight, so we're also going to change out the engine. And we're going to, therefore, have to actually rebuild the airframe. Yeah, actually, this thing is probably too expensive for us to buy, right? We very quickly work ourselves into this problem set. And sometimes I hear air-launched effects talked about in the same way. There's the good discussion about air-launched effects, which is how do I create that integrated strike package to punch a window. And there's the bad discussion of integrated effects, which is how do I have the helicopter stand far enough back and still hit things that it's safe. It's just contributing to its survivability. Why is that a bad way of thinking about air-launched effects? Because the question immediately becomes, why do I have the helicopter? If the munition is over the horizon, then most of the complexity and capability needs to be in the munition. And actually, I can launch that from a palletized or truck-based system. Maybe I do want to use aviation to get the truck where it needs to be to launch, or the pallet, but that doesn't need to be a complicated platform. And this brings me back to that flexibility point. There is a huge amount, particularly in a littoral environment where we are looking to potentially operate, that is on offer from really simple, really rugged aviation platforms that can do logistics, redeployment, maneuvering materiel and people. And what determines their utility is actually their efficiency of scale. Now, in the US Army's case, given the number of Black Hawks that it already has in service, the number of Chinooks, there's economies of scale in operating those platforms. They're extremely capable, and it makes sense for the US Army to retain those systems. So again, I think we see a logic to what the Army has prioritized. For other users, the point I'm getting at is that there is real value in a ruggedized and modular aviation platform that allows us to be flexible in how we employ it, rather than trying to cram everything onto the platform and in the process make it far, far too expensive. I'm going to finally end by talking about UAVs, because they are a critical component of the aviation enterprise, uncrewed systems. What I would put to you is that UAVs are very, very different to aviation assets in the core things that they offer. By taking the human out of the system, we can take more risk. How much risk we take at that point is largely determined by how cheap the thing is. How many can we produce? How many specialist subsystems do I lose or expose when I push it in? And therefore, there is a ruthless drive to simplify the device. How do you simplify a device? You simplify its purpose. And so if aviation is about flexibility, fusion, and giving the commander options through reach and range, UAVs allow you to achieve tasks efficiently and accept risk because you can scale. And scale and simplicity comes from ruthless specialization of what this thing is for. Multi-mission UAVs, to be perfectly honest with you, are usually a bad proposition, because on any given mission, you're going to lose quite a lot of them. And all of the capability that was built into that platform to pursue other missions is essentially wasted on that mission when it was destroyed. The other thing I would highlight about UAVs, or air-launched effects, is that they are something that you have to update continuously. The update cycle for software, or for frequencies and for C2 is often hours. For software, it's often a couple of weeks. For hardware, you are looking out, swapping out systems, usually within 6 to 12 weeks, determined by when did the enemy capture one and get to look at it, and when did they start being able to generate exquisite electronic warfare effects against that platform. And what that means is we need to be really careful about how we integrate that into the aviation enterprise. In a lot of armies, I hear people say, aviators understand the airspace, training, integration with the Air Force, therefore they should own UAS because they have the skills and the expertise. It's true, but most of our processes for certifying airframes, for example, for qualifying somebody to operate them, have come from, as the Vice Chief was saying, platforms that come as a defined package and are certified as a tangible object. UAVs are not like that. You are going to be experimenting and updating them all the time. Their behavior is not only going to be inconsistent and unreliable in some cases because you're fiddling with them all the time, it is also going to be affected by the enemy. And you don't know what EW effects they are going to push at you, so you can't predict how it will behave. And so when we think about the gearing between these communities, the thought that I want to leave you with is how do we integrate, on the one hand, really quite expensive platforms where we prioritize the protection of the skilled pilots and operators inside them that offer those core attributes I highlighted, with an ecosystem of effects that are interchangeable, updatable, modular, but therefore inherently quite risky. I think the US Army is getting after that with transformation in contact, but they have to have the industrial base behind them to do it. You know, the most important thing when I think about the industrial side of UAVs is not who makes the best UAV, it's who can provide me with the subsystems at scale. Do we have the industrial base to keep producing cameras cheaply, warheads cheaply, navigation units, radios and data links? Can we afford to lose them? And if we can get that right, then not only can we keep our aviators alive, get them on the X, deliver the effect, but we can also transition the burden of risk from people to machines and stay relevant throughout the decades ahead. I'm going to leave my comments there. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to following up afterwards with debate, challenge, questions, and please come up and tell me why I'm wrong. Thank you very much.